Welcome to the Athletic Performance Podcast, a conversation for all things performance related, where we push the boundaries of speed, power, and strength. I'm your host, Ryan Patrick, and we're here to discuss, debate, and enhance athletic development for coaches and athletes alike. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Today on the podcast, we have Kevin Kirsch. Kevin is a doctor of physical therapy, the co-owner of the Athlete's Edge PT in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and he spends his time helping people get strong, fast, and out of pain in person and online. Today we discuss how to work with large groups of kids and get them to fall in love with training. We talk about getting large groups of athletes to do the basics savagely well and how to fill empty buckets. We also discuss working with female athletes and what we feel like are some of the high leverage points in working with these underpowered and often undertrained athletes. And we also get into the therapy side a little bit, talking about how a diagnosis is not a death sentence. If you're a coach who works with athletes, you definitely want to listen to this episode. We cover a lot of ground with regard to the X's and O's of training, but also talk about the softer skills of working with young humans to help make them successful in their sport. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast and rate and review, 5 stars only, this episode when you finish. Thanks for listening.
But yeah, so I had those kids, some of them like from freshman to junior year, like I saw them 6 days a week basically. And then like in the season, I'd maybe be at practice like 2 days a week and I'd get all the games. So that was the hardest part of moving, honestly. It was like I felt like I had, 25, 30 little brothers that I was leaving. So that was, but I talked to a bunch of the other coaches and teachers and stuff, and they're like, there's never going to be a good time. Because I was like, oh, maybe I'll stay one more year. I really want to see their senior year. And they're like, you're just going to get attached to the class behind them. And then you're going to want to do the same thing. And they're like, you got to kind of rip a Band-Aid whenever. So I still talk to them a lot. I handed that off to like 2 guys who are running that since I moved, which is cool. So I'm still in contact with them, like helping them with programming and learning the business side of things a little bit. So that's good. But yeah.
I'm really curious, like your experience being on that side of it, because being in the private sector, it's always, well, I don't know what you're doing with your coach. And we're starting to get some programs in our area that actually have strength and conditioning coaches, which I think is really nice and valuable. And I think more kids should take advantage of it. But then it's, well, coach was upset, so we did 1,000 of something. I'm like, oh, shit. So I always felt like I'm kind of in this reactive mode. Like, I guess a simple question, like how many guys that you worked with had a trainer outside? And I don't know. I just want to hear what are your gripes from the inside?
Yeah. So it's funny because I also used to be like more private sector. I'd have a few kids here and there. And my assumption always as a PT and a coach, I'd ask kids, what did you do at your team lift? With the assumption that it was pretty terrible. And often they describe things that were not very good. So I would have that stigma of, oh, your team lift is bad. And I'd tell them mine was better, basically. And it was almost like a selling point. And you see that a lot in the industry. I feel like you see the private trainers kind of crap on the school lifts.
There's a lot of turf wars.
Yeah, a ton. And they'll kind of like talk down on it and try to convince the kids that it's bad for them and stuff and tell them to skip that or like half-ass it or whatever. And it's funny to watch that because that was my assumption and I would never really talk to the coach. And then when I was on the other side of it, I'd be like, I just tell the kids like, hey, have your private trainer reach out to me and I'll send them our program and then they can build around our program. And very rarely did people take me up on that. And it was always funny because then like I'm on that side and I'm like, well, I think very highly of my program. So it's funny, like now these kids through their school program for free are getting a very high level program. Some of them are choosing to go do private things. And then they tell me what they're doing. And I'd be like, that doesn't actually sound that good. So it's always like it was a weird balance. We got really good buy-in, to be honest. That was when I started. The head coach told me, he was like, we just want to make sure guys are lifting. So if they have private trainers, we don't force them to come to the team lifts. And that first like 3-6 months, there were probably more guys who stuck with their like private coach. But after the season and everything, we had almost 90-95% attendance of the team, like to our team lifts, which was really awesome. And it was good buy-in. And I specifically did not do what you said. I never used the weight room as punishment. So my very first My very first year, I kind of shared that coaching role with a guy who had played in the program. He had played high level D1 football in 2000. And he was very much like on top of me about we need to build mental toughness in the weight room. And I just kind of had to come through it and be like, look, they're 14 years old. Like, it's not college. I just want them to lift forever. Because I'm sure you see it a lot. You see that former college pro athlete who hates lifting, and then because they had to do it. So when they stop, they hate training and they don't want to keep going. And my goal was like, I want these kids to fall in love with training. So I want it to be fun. I want to explain everything to them. There's never a time where I'm going to say because I said so. And don't get me wrong, we had to do some punishment stuff here and there when they would screw around, like when they would play foam roller baseball with a lacrosse ball and break something. That would be times where I'd have to punish them a little. But yeah, it was always the turf war was always really interesting, and I just tried to be as like collaborative as I could. So every now and then, a trainer would, and I would just send them the program, and they would go, "Oh, okay, cool. Like you guys squat every Monday, so we'll make sure we do something different on Tuesday." And that's how I structured it when I got some of the guys as private guys. I would just come at it from, look, we're going to do completely different complementary things on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and the team lifts on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And that's how I built it, and that's how I think most private coaches should try to go about, is like try to get a hold of their program if they can and see if you can be like somewhat reactive. But yeah, I also had a patient one time who was a high school football player at a different school, and they were running some sort of barbaric triphasic cycle where they were putting on 125% of their one rep max back squat and doing 6-second lowers with 3 spotters, and the kid had knee pain. And I was like, all right, well, that's probably not that good. So it kind of depends.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Wow. I'm always empathetic to guys that have to run these programs. The people in our area, there were a couple larger training groups who were headlined by some really great guys. So we had a guy in our area that worked with this company called Ignition. He ended up going out to, I think, the University of Washington with their football team. So obviously they're just coming off the heels of a national championship game. So a ton of success, and he was really great. But some of these programs, they would have younger interns, and I always want to be collaborative with these guys. They don't want to communicate that much, but the thing I think I'm most empathetic about is you've got some younger faces, maybe not as much experience. I'm not saying these guys aren't smart, but when you've got that many kids in an environment and you have limited time, like it becomes really difficult to manage it's a lot of quality control, right? So I'm always curious. So what are your big rocks when you try to program this stuff? How are you managing that? Like what kind of logistical things have you found that just really work and just allow you to get this dialed in? Because I know you're a guy I've seen these guys lift, I've seen the reels, I've seen the stories, like it looks good. So how do you do that? What's working for you?
Yeah, so I try to have the big rocks be like some sort of squat, some sort of pull, or sorry, some sort of hinge, I guess, and then some sort of push. So usually a version of a bench press, whatever we have available to us. And I just try to put those constraints in there that we're going to do it as quality as possible. So like I was fortunate enough that first year, it was a public school, but it was relatively good booster club. So they put out there, what would be the coach at the end of the first season asked me, what would you want? And I was like, I would love squat wedges. I would love safety squat bars. They were like, send me some links. We'll see what we can get. And then the next day I got a text and they're like, cool, we bought 7 of each. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, that was good. Could I have asked to just get paid more? That would have been cool too. But, so I was able to put those constraints on the kids where it's like, cool, we're not going to back squat because that's going to get a little funky sometimes. So let's safety bar squat. Let's use the wedges if they need them. If they don't need them, we'll figure that out. And I would usually try to pair that with something. So I would do a lot of like post-activation potentiation. Look, you're going to do a set of squats and then you're going to jump. And we had 7 racks. We would usually have 5 to 7 kids per rack, depending on the attendance of the lift. So they would just kind of cycle through, and we would try to keep them accountable the best we could. And honestly, a lot of that just involved coaching dynamic type stuff. Let's put a senior at each rack to make sure we have stuff there's someone staying on task and things, and try to split up guys by relative weights that they were doing. So there wasn't a lot of changing of weights to keep people on track. So that would usually be like the first 15, 20 minutes would be like one main lift with one main jump. Depending on level, we might mix in like some plus plyos type stuff as warm-ups, like just getting them jumping, skipping, doing different things. A lot of that we started like freshman year with them. We would just kind of get in lines and go through some plus plyo stuff, because like you watch a 13-year-old try to do like a broad jump sometimes and you see some absolutely insane things. So that's where we would kind of bring that in as early into the program as possible. And then I would just always do a circuit of accessory work. That was very full body approach. So like we didn't do leg day on the circuit. I would try to fill in the gaps. So if it was squats, we would do maybe some single arm pressing, some rows, some hinges there, like more of the single arm stuff, mix in some like core type stuff. And then we would always finish with competition. And the competition would usually be like running based, but maybe with task constraints. So like hop over a hurdle, hop over a box, hold a med ball, stuff like that. We break up into teams. And that was one of the coolest ways to like really keep the guys engaged, because it was like, look, we have this like kind of dangling carrot. We're going to have a fun competition at the end. And then depending on how well they did, that competition may change. Maybe we're doing more like isometric holds or things like that. And we did have to get a little bit like disciplinarian sometimes. That's where the other coach was helpful. We instituted a whistle rule. Like I had to stand there with my whistle around my neck like a gym teacher. And like when I blow the whistle, everyone has to get quiet. If you don't get quiet and I blow a second whistle, we're going to do up, down. So there was that component. And I do think that's where sometimes younger coaches do struggle with that, is like riding the line between disciplinarian and a friend. So that's where that's kind of how I structured it. It worked really well. Honestly, they were great kids. Like it was good buy-in. I think having a really good head coach, like the head coach was a yeller. So like they didn't want to get in trouble with the head coach. So like that was good to have his support, and that kind of a good organization. That was fun to see.
Yeah, I always start a little overly militant. We have this baseball group, this team that came in, and I'll freely admit, teams are not my specialty. I think I can run a really quality program. We had 20 guys in a pretty small square footage of space, and it ran like clockwork. But it was so funny because they came in, and some of these kids had never, I mean, you can look at them and tell they've never seen the inside of the weight room. They're baseball guys. Some of them don't care to be there. And I always struggle with that, right? Because most of the athletes that we have raise their hand. They want to be there. They've made the decision. I want to play varsity. I want to make the team. I want to go to college. They're there to level up. But there's always a few stragglers who don't love the weight room. And so it does become this challenge of, I don't want to make this punitive for the kid, because I think training is awesome and helped my career in numerous ways, even though I was like average at best athlete. But just physically, it really improved me. But when they started, I mean, I had the metronome playing over the speaker and we were working at the tempo. I'm like, you guys are going to learn how to lift. This is the tempo we're using. Everyone's going to follow it. And it was just like, we started the set at the same time. The group rested at the same time. The B group would come in and do their thing. And it was just, it started like that. And then over time, it just kind of started pulling back a little bit and a little bit. And they were able to maintain pretty good execution, I think, over the course of the off season. Now, Christmas kind of threw a wrench. They had a couple weeks off. We had some new faces who were transitioning from other sports. But overall, it's one of those things. It's almost easier to start with a tight grip and then kind of loosen as you go, because I've made the mistake on the opposite end where it was a little too loose in the beginning, or maybe too naive to really think about how they would approach this. And it's hard to get control after the fact. And I don't have anybody there. So it's, oh shit, I'm on my own here.
Yeah, that's how I would do it too in the summers. In the summer, we would have, I would have 2 hours with one group, which was the sophomore to seniors, and then I would have 2 hours with the incoming freshmen, which I didn't need that amount of time with, so we ended up cutting that down to an hour and a half. But we split it up so the incoming freshmen aren't intimidated by the kids who like already know how to lift. And yeah, that first group, it's the summer, it's 7 a.m., 8 a.m. I'm letting them pick the music. They know what to do. They're having a good time. They're there voluntarily. And then, yeah, at 10 o'clock, I had to switch to, all right, cool. The music's off. Every group is in a line. we're rotating on a whistle. Like, you don't talk while the set is going on. Like, it had to start really militant, and then they would kind of like earn that. But yeah, every year there's always one day with the freshmen where I'd have to be like, cool, this is the day that I have to be a jerk. And this year it was really funny because it was like day 3 or whatever, and I was like, all right, we're gonna barbell bench press. We're gonna pick weights that you can safely do 15 because we're doing 10s, and you're gonna rotate through. And 4 seconds in, I look over and some kid is buried by 115 because he tried to 1-rep max it, and 3 kids are ripping it off his throat. And I was like, cool, we're going and running hills for the next 40 minutes. And so it's harder though in the private setting because it's hard when kids are paying to be there, and then punishing them it's difficult. So yeah, I think the more structured you are in the beginning and then giving that leeway, that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, some of those kids, it's like they're not obligated to be there, but they're expected to be, and you can tell. And we had this one guy, we just called him Duck because it was just a spinoff of his last name, but Duck did not like lifting, like at all.
Yeah.
And I knew it, and it was just funny because we would have these moments. I'm like, look, man, I know you don't want to be here. I see you. I get it. You're not going to love this as much as I do. I'm like, I'm going to meet you where you're at. I need you to give me this. You can do that. And it was good. He came in. I got a set level, what I needed out of him. It wasn't as much as I think most of my athletes opt for, but for a guy who didn't love lifting and everything else, I'm like, this is agreeable. I can do this.
Yeah.
But it just cracked me up.
Yeah, it's funny.
I want to kind of backpedal a little bit because you highlighted some things I think that I don't see a lot in the programs that are in our area. First of all, I don't know how much time our guys have with athletes, like when they're training. I don't know if they have an hour. I don't know if it's an hour and a half. I don't know if it's 2 hours. No idea.
Yep.
Most of the programs, or most of what I hear when my athletes try to report back to me, first of all, they forget the name of everything. But it just sounds like a lot of lifting. You've done a good job of incorporating some of the, I think, force velocity stuff that is going to be more useful to an athlete. Right? Strength's useful for these young kids up to a point, but you're doing plyos, you're doing post-activation potentiation, you're using kind of these training concepts that I think are going to really help speed and power over the long haul. And I don't know. I mean, tell me, like, what were these kids doing prior to this? How much of a difference do you feel like this is making? How hard is this to actually incorporate? Just what got you to actually start to use this with a large group like that?
Yeah, so the guy before me it was interesting. Seemed like a really good guy. He definitely was like struggling to control the group type thing. So he did very like circuit style of training. It almost looked like a high intensity interval type thing. And I sat down with some kids before we kind of started my first sessions, and I asked for the feedback on what they had been doing because I didn't want to like totally uproot it. And a lot of them were like, we didn't like this because they're football players and they were like losing weight because they couldn't lift heavy enough. Like they were just constantly doing stuff. So I was like, all right, cool. I'll try to balance that out a little bit. And it took a little bit of experimentation. I came in about a week before their season started. That first season I worked with them. So I was an in-season coach that first little bit. So I was like just trying to keep them healthy. That's why I kind of took this full body approach. We did a lot of single leg work in the season. Like I was just trying to like keep them from getting too injured. And they had kind of a rough season. They'd expected to be a lot better than they were. They weren't as good. So like we had to kind of redo things from the ground up after that. And I just tried to observe like what big issues were, and concussions were a big issue that first year, and calf and hamstring cramps. I mean, guys were going down like a lot more than I would have expected. And it kind of came out that they weren't doing much hopping, they weren't doing much plyos, they weren't doing any direct lower leg kind of strengthening. So stuff that I started incorporating immediately were like tib raises, foam roller bridges, like different styles of calf raises, things like that. And after that first year, like nobody cramped, which was kind of interesting because like they had gone through these crazy hydration protocols. Like they had the former coach who like he gave them a hydration protocol. They were like drinking pickle juice mixed with honey, mixed with lemon, mixed with like X amounts of water. Yeah, like they like thought that was the secret. And I was like, I think you guys just don't have enough like time under tension. We did a lot of neck isolation. So like I tried to just bring in as much like I tried to kind of approach it. We mostly had an hour. So I would try to like, try to go as full body as I can, touch on things, try to mix up stuff like the plyos and the games, but then have a lot of repetition in the accessory work. I mean, we probably didn't change up I would change one accessory lift every couple weeks, but they probably did the same version of a landmine press and like a dumbbell row for 3 years straight with me, because it was like, let's get really good at the basics, and then that will get boring to them after a while. So that's where the games came in and stuff like that. So that's how I always try to incorporate it. Also felt with the games and the agility stuff that really helped the concussions. Guys aren't good at looking around anymore, like spatial awareness, peripheral vision. I don't know if that's phones, video games. I'm not trying to like blame kids these days per se, but I think like sometimes, especially football, kids were one sport athletes for football. And football season's really short. Like, it's not like soccer or baseball where you can play it year round. There's some 7-on stuff, but for linemen especially, they really only have a 12-week season. So we had to find other ways to mix in just like that athleticism component. So that's kind of how I came about that essentially. And yeah, hopefully that answered that. Hopefully I didn't go off on too much of a tangent.
Yeah, I think one of the best, I've always thought of that as a strength, is like football guys don't. No, I thought of that as a strength, is a lot of the football guys don't have season year round, so they actually get some time off. I mean, it's damaging as hell to their bodies, right? I mean, they're just getting thrashed for 16 weeks or whatever their season is, but it's if they're not playing other sports, what are they doing? Are they just playing Xbox between? Which is fine, I get it. They're teenagers, play some Xbox, but you're just hanging with your head forward doing it, or are you actually out there doing stuff? So I think it's really wise and smart to include some of that stuff, right? Because it's so simple when you really think about it. Like, where you want to be and where you are now, it's not a couple swigs of Vlasic. Like, it's more basic than that, to believe it or not. We're actually going to train the thing, and the thing is that you're not doing anything below the knee, which is partially probably the pedigree we've got in America for strength and conditioning, right? It's all bigger, faster, stronger. No matter how much this field evolves, like, it's still hard for people to just understand, especially for younger athletes. And I get being like a teenage dude, like, I just want to get jacked and look the part. If it makes me a better athlete too, that's cool. But I'm thinking about girls in a lot of cases, honestly. Pro tip, like, guys are going to notice the changes more than girls.
Mm-hmm.
Take that for what you want. But we still just value top end strength so much, and there's just so much more to it because the speed and the time constraints of sport just necessitate, like, we have to do more of this hopping. We have to do more dynamic stuff. We can't just do strength. Like, there's an end game to where it just stops becoming valuable.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it was very interesting to work with football players, especially because I had to balance kids. I had to balance the fact that, like, some of these kids were expected to put on a lot of weight too, because we had a smaller team. We needed linemen, and some of the best teams in the program's history had 5 linemen that were all 270 plus, and we definitely didn't have that when I was there. So that's what I'd have to try to balance. And there were some other guys that the kids would work with prior. There was one coach in particular who I think did a lot of good stuff with them, but he really focused on packing on size onto these kids. And by the time they were seniors, they were like kind of slow. And then that's where some of them started to drift over to me for the private stuff. I didn't intend to be their private strength coach. It was kind of an accidental business that started after the second year because a bunch of kids wanted to start. And yeah, one kid in particular stands out. Like, he should have been like a higher level D1 lineman, and he went from maybe 250 to like 285 up to like his senior year. And then when he went to camps, I think he ran like a 5'7" as an offensive lineman. But like he just immediately got crossed off every big level school because they're like, that's too slow. And what I think you need to do is you need to try to keep that athleticism as they're gaining the weight, and realize that it's hard because, like, you have to be at a certain level to get recruited by the time you're 17, 18. And then it's like it's a time thing. But yeah, I think just keeping those qualities of athleticism are really important. But it's funny, like, You say guys will notice the change more than girls will, but I feel like when you can get the high school girls to buy into the program, you see the biggest change on the field with them, especially compared to their peers, because it's getting better for sure, but there definitely are not as many full like girls teams lifting. So you get those kids that are super dedicated to it, and they start to stand out so much more. So
Oh my gosh, we love our female athletes. And I tell the parents all the time, like, this is the lowest hanging fruit for females. We're talking about girls who don't have the testosterone advantage that a boy going through puberty does in high school, right? Like one of my coaches right now, he's coaching basketball, like assistant coach for one of the local high schools, varsity basketball. A lot of their girls are down. They have eighth graders starting. Physically, girls can handle that. They're like, most of them are reaching their peak height around that age anyway. Guys, you put an eighth grader on a varsity game, it's a order of magnitude difference in just the physical dominance. Even if the senior's horrible at basketball, they're just going to dominate this person. So I don't understand sometimes these kids, they're taking hitting lessons, they're doing volleyball, all the separate like year-round stuff. And I'm like, have you just considered the possibility of being physically dominant over everyone, of getting a couple inches higher and spiking it off some girl's face? This is, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills sometimes when I explain this to parents. Like, you want her to play at this level, and the physics of what she's actually able to do don't match what that level is. Those girls are going to be just soaring over her and destroying her, and she's going to be unable to keep up.
Yeah. It's funny with that. But yeah, that's where I actually, especially in the private setting, like really enjoyed working with like the female high school athletes, because when they are bought in, like you see these great changes. And often it is just by, with guys, sometimes like I would have them come in and they'd have this history of lifting with their football team or wherever they did their own like bodybuilding style stuff. So we'd almost have to be like, all right, cool, let's get a little more nuanced. Whereas a lot of the female athletes didn't have a background in lifting, so we could just hammer absolute basics, single leg strength, single arm pressing, and you'd see this wild improvement with the most basic program. But it'd be awesome. My coolest success story is still my first high school athlete in Colorado. She like was kind of a shy, awkward kid, and she was a PT patient, and she would drive 40 minutes down to train in my garage gym, and she was a high school thrower. And she like, I think her best discus was like 82 feet or something like that. And we lifted for a whole off season. I know nothing about throwing. We did no throwing skills. And I was like, we just need to get you strong and mobile. And the next year she finished second in state. She threw 127 feet. She was deadlifting like 405 by the time she left high school at 5 pounds. It was awesome. And she still like lifts to this day and loves training. And yeah, she's like still the one I hold up. She's also the one that I point to the high school kids when they like think their deadlift's much high. And I'm like, guys, I had an 18-year-old girl deadlift 450 once. So let's not get too excited about your 315. So
Let's pump the brakes, fellas.
Exactly.
Yeah, a lot of the females, because we get the parents, they'll come in, they're like, hey, we want her, to work on explosion or footwork. And I'm like, okay, I totally appreciate that. I'm like, but she needs to lift. And I kind of dance around this, right? I'm like, well, we in terms of just the development to get her where you want, there's things we have to do at this stage. And when she gets that, we'll go to the next stage. But a lot of the females are really force deficient, right? I mean, they're just, and I always use a car analogy. I know nothing about cars, but they're the Honda. It's the smart car, whatever. There's just not a big engine. They can't get, you can push the pedal all the way down, but it's only gonna go so fast. Like we get a Mustang or Lamborghini or something with a big engine. Yeah. Now we've got some horsepower. Now we can start to optimize. Now we can work on rate of force development. Now we can work on dynamic stuff and being more explosive. And again, I think to your point, there's a thread of this always woven in, right? So I'm not completely throwing this stuff out. It's just in terms of what's the priority, I feel like the girls are there. Now the guys can go either way, right? So we've got these young kind of prepubescent 8th graders, freshmen who are clearly force deficient as well. There's some who just have natural gifts and they're very velocity biased. They usually don't like the gym. They're like your springy basketball guys. But there's some guys, probably to your point, they've been in the game so long, they've lifted, and they've trained themselves to be slow because while it is high force, it's very slow contraction. So I, I don't know where to go with this, but it's just how you communicate this to people when you're talking to them. Because I think I'm on the same page as you, man.
Yeah, there's a thing that I've started to see, and I think there's a lot of other people who are probably seeing a similar thing, especially with the female athletes, which is like when I went through PT school, this is 10 years ago now, they would talk about like the female incidents of ACLs and stuff like that. And it was through the roof. I remember some of like my athlete friends in high school, like one girl's on like her third ACL. We were just told like girls are different basically. And there wasn't much emphasis on getting them in the weight room. So I'm honestly fascinated a lot of times by like good strength and conditioning for female sports. If that becomes more pervasive from that 8th, 9th grade level on, like, will we start to see the incidence of ACLs drop? And like, it's anecdotal, but a lot of the people that I've worked with, like their rates of injury are lower. And I don't know if I've had one maybe, but, and you can't bulletproof anyone, but like the average rate of female athlete to the average number of ACLs, like my clientele is definitely lower, and selling injury prevention to parents is difficult, but like it's a borderline unethical thing sometimes, but you have to be careful with it. But I think sometimes just pointing that out, like just being stronger is potentially going to reduce the risk of those injuries, can be helpful. I think that starts to motivate them a lot more, especially when you start to get at the team level, coaches, club directors, stuff like that. Like you'll see that a little bit more. And I think just training them similarly is the big thing too. Like sometimes you get like strength conditioning programs for female athletes and they won't have them touch weights or things, or they want them to be doing like the fast footwork stuff. And I'm like, well, just like you said, force into the ground is what's going to help that. Let's work on jumping and landing and things like that. And as much as landing mechanics gets a bad rap, like that can be really helpful with 7th graders, like just to try to work on that sometimes. But yeah, it is interesting, like when you are in that group, trying not to get too specific, like, oh, like we're going to do an only plyo day. Like you kind of have to mix and match, and those qualities are probably going to help everyone.
Yeah, some of these kids just needed to play. We cut snap downs out years ago. I'm like, these are not doing shit. Like, we're just like throwing our hands at the ground. And I'm like, the reality is like, none of you are ever going to land in this perfectly like aligned stuff. So we have to be able to manage the stress. I think that's where like the plus plyos is somewhat really valued, was just, you're doing extensive type work, which if you're listening, you don't know what that is. It's just low intensity, but high volume. So just kind of continuous. And you're just doing it in a lot of different planes. You're doing it in a lot of different directions. You're just kind of changing that stress. Whereas most stuff was just sagittal, going forward, maybe backwards if we're getting frisky. But it was just all like straight ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I think that's the biggest thing about the plus plyo stuff that was like really cool to bring into the program for the kids, is it's more fun too than just doing landing mechanics. And honestly, like I'm the same way. Like I won't do snap downs anymore, but I do think like hopping off boxes, trying to stick it on one leg, trying to stick it on two, doing it sideways, doing it with spin, like that can be really good. And then you can point out deviations. I do think our movement optimism, like the movement optimism group, or the movement optimism movement that's on Instagram right now, is going a little too far with that. Like, putting the stills of NFL players landing on one leg. All right, cool. Yes, that might work with your NFL players if you're training them, but we might not want to emphasize that for our 7th grade girls.
Yeah, we talked about that. Gosh, who was I talking to? Anyway, but the whole idea was these movement guys, these gurus, are taking a still shot of a 240 frame per second video and saying, this is what caused it. His ankle bone got too low or something crazy. And it's funny too, because 5 different camps will look at the same video and see completely different shit. And I'm like, so what are we actually looking here? Like, what are the similarities across this? And I think for the NFL stuff, I'm like, well, he had a 300-pound man forcing him into that position. So if you can figure out how to avoid that, let me know. In the meantime, knock it off. Please, just stop.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like now that I have sort of like an Instagram following. Like I've said to a few people, if you ever watch me make a reaction video to an injury, please slap me and tell me to delete that. Like when everyone in the world had to share their opinion on why Aaron Rodgers tore his ACL while he had a 350 pound, or his Achilles, while he had a 350-pound man on his back, I was like, it was probably that. It probably wasn't the turf. It probably wasn't like whatever theory you have. It was probably the fact that he was in full dorsiflexion trying to push off with a man twice his size on his back. Like, it's just that simple sometimes. And yeah, it was, but yeah, to see everyone's like knees over toes stuff or GOTA stuff or whatever they needed to bring in there to that argument, I was like, this is not where I want to drive my attention.
No, and I get it. It drives clicks. It's super edgy, and I think a lot of people just want the solution, right? They want a black and white answer to a problem that's very nuanced. I think movement is super nuanced. I think even when we do our assessments, I'm going to check range of motion. I'm going to look at all these things, and even if I'm doing, let's say, body weight squats, toe touches, some types of crawling or locomotion or whatever it is, I'm looking at people in a low force, low velocity, low fatigue situation. The environment, the context of what they're doing is completely different. And these things are going to be very dynamic and emergent in real time. And so we have to account for a certain level of variance, right? I'm not going to, if I have no hip internal rotation, which I don't, I know there's probably certain positions I'm not going to be able to get into or acquire. And I just need to understand on a broad level what these substitutions are likely to be. Right. But it's to say, oh, because of this, and you're always going to play it this way, and it's always going to be WODA, and you're broken, and look at how Panther walks. And I mean, I get it. I think there's probably value in some of this stuff, but I think it's also fodder for Instagram and soundbite, clickbait, that kind of stuff to drive people. Maybe they have some education on the back end. I don't know. It hasn't attracted me enough, but I'm kind of all over the place with this. I think what I'm trying to say is just, movement is nuanced, it's highly variable, and to be able to predict this stuff with any level of certainty, I think one is irresponsible, if not asinine.
For sure. I think most people who are somewhat reasonable about it, they realize like the GOTA stuff is probably a little far out, and the WEC method stuff is a little far out. Where I've started to get a little like concerned about the education level is like some of these more, I think they're doing a lot of good things as coaches, but they're starting to get into the nothing matters realm. So there are no good movements, so we'll just do whatever. And I think that's interesting to a point, like dismissing like landing mechanics. But I do think there's something to be said for being really good at the basics. And I've seen you talk about this, like when you put up like pictures or videos of like high level movers, they have things in common. Like fast people do a lot of things the same way, and if a kid can't dorsiflex, like we probably need to work on that to a point, rather than just being like, oh, nothing matters, let's do Jefferson deadlifts and hurdle hops and play games and stuff like that. There could be a world where those are helpful, but we still need to get really good at the basics. And I think some coaches and PTs now are starting to look at the nothing matters realm, and they're skipping that. They're starting to swing to that pendulum that like the basics don't matter at all. And that's where I start to get a little concerned, especially as what's harder. Like when we went through we sound like old men now, but like when we went through our schooling, like the Instagram coaches didn't exist. So we kind of had to like learn the basics in school and try them, and then start to form theories outside of that. Whereas you can plug in as a young coach and a young PT now onto Instagram and think you found the answer 50 times a day with these crazy things, and you can start to fall into that nothing matters realm. And that's where when I'm like mentoring people, I try to bring them back to the basics sometimes, which is surprising for where I would have been 5 years ago when I was like diving into the weeds a little bit more.
Yeah, it can get a little like esoteric. I'm trying to think of how to unpack this, right? Because training, I think people need to appreciate this, is general prep at pretty much every level, right? Even if I'm doing drills that are specific to a running back, like we got this fill the hole drill, right? So there's a couple defenders that are stacked and a guy's running towards them, and then they kind of break. And if there's 3 defenders, there's basically 4 holes. So they have to react and find the open thing. That's still very, very general because they're not in pads. They're not breaking a tackle from another lineman. They're not filling the gap and chasing them the same way. They're just trying to make him make a decision about which direction to go. So it with general stuff, we're still trying to chase general qualities. If I'm trying to improve the potential for maximal muscular power, like there are certain exercises that are going to allow me to maximize that output. And then later I want to transfer that into sport, but it doesn't have to be like, I don't have to make training model this. Like I'm chasing a certain adaptation. I think identifying what those things are from a kind of baseline fitness attribute is really important. But on the other side, it's like, I have to tell people like those world-class performances, like those athletes have compensations. Like you don't throw a baseball 100 miles an hour without some kind of compensation. Like you have to give up something. Maybe it's range of motion. Maybe it's a healthy labrum. Like you're going to sacrifice this stuff to make that possible. And the example I always love to give is we had two NFL guys at the same time. One was a running back, one was a lineman. And I would tell people I would intentionally almost toe the line of pathology in terms of how much range of motion my lineman had. Because I didn't want a lineman who was super mobile, because that's a guy who has to manage more range of motion. He has to create more stability, and he's potentially easier to turn. But I need enough mobility for him to be able to do his job and to be able to train at a really high level without experiencing pain. So you're kind of living in this gray area. It's, hey, we need some more hip rotation, but not too much. And so I just think a lot of this gets lost in this, we'll do whatever. And training is just play. It's just fun. That's silly. It's almost like kind of reverting back to CrossFit where it's you're like, to me, it's like, if I want an adaptation, I'm going to apply a stress and intensify that stress over time so that these, whatever adaptation I'm looking for, gets potentially better and better.
Yeah.
I'm ranting.
No, I like it though. Because for me, yeah, the way that I look at it is very similar. Like you need to give a lot of general qualities to people, and you want to get really specific, but you should almost, you have to be able to do certain things to like almost get to the level where the more chaos helps people. I feel, because take like A skips, for example. A skips might not be the answer to making me faster. Doing a bunch of A skips might not make me faster. But I bet if you took most of the really fast athletic people in the world and had them do A skips, they can do A skips really well. So if you take little Timmy who can't do A skips at all and he's super uncoordinated, and you're like, oh, well, A skips don't matter. We'll just go play dodgeball to warm up and do all these other crazy activities. I'm not sure he's going to develop that skill without actually working on it here and there. And maybe it's because he's weak in certain areas and he doesn't have hip extension or whatever. It might not be just working on A skips, but you have to have the lens and the system to figure that out. And they should probably be able to do the basics well. And that's where I think people start to lose it, is you're not gonna make that very sub-average athlete very good by doing the chaos things. That's where that might help the elite athletes. And that's the whole thing, mimicking what the pros do or mimicking what works for one person. You obviously have to be careful there. But yeah, that's like what I start to see a little bit. And that's where I think being dismissive of things like the landing mechanics or those basic drills, again, the best can probably do those drills really well. And that's like where we start to work on that.
I try to communicate that to people all the time. I'm like, look, the best athletes I've seen, excuse me, they don't do anything super fancy. I'll tell you what they do. They do the common things uncommonly well. When they warm up with some plyos, you look at it and you're like, oh shit, there's levels to this that I didn't even know. Like it's almost this lack of awareness that some of my athletes have. And it's not anything wrong with them. They just haven't seen it, right? It's like explaining water to a fish. They don't even know. Yep. There's this Swedish sprinter. She's a female, and I'll pull the videos and be like, look at this, guys. Look at her go. Like she'll do her A skip. She'll do like single leg ply. She does stuff, and it is so violent and fast and aggressive. I'm like, this is the level of intent that you need to apply to this stuff. right? Do I think an A skip is the end all be all? No. Come on now. Like, serious, like we're gonna skip down the turf and all of a sudden you're gonna be super fast. It's more about like rhythm and posture. And for some of my athletes, just that phase shift of, okay, we're about to begin training in kind of getting that mindset stuff. But I mean, it really does come back to that. Common things uncommonly well. And sometimes the revelation of that is really eye-opening for my athletes.
Yeah, and it's funny because the more and more that I practice as a PT and a coach, that's kind of the spectrum for most things. I've started to get rid of some of the crazier correctives for some of those basic things. Like, all right, cool. We just need to get you really good at basic movements, and then we need to get you back to whatever you're trying to do. But if you can't, say your foot can't pronate or you can't expand your ribs posteriorly, okay, that's a basic to me. We need to do that, but we don't necessarily need to do all these crazy things at once. So once you get the basics down, then we get into where you need to be. So yeah, I think just like the better you can get at that, I mean, that applies to most things. I think it applies to your coaching cues, your assessments, like just getting good at the basics. And then you can bring in, I liked what I think I saw Dan Pfaff talk about this. Like, you should have 5 to 10% of your year where you're just experimenting with your training program. Like, bring in the weird stuff, have the experiments, see if they last, but do the 80% of what you know is going to work for sure. 10% maybe you're still a little unsure. 10% you have no idea and you're just experimenting. I think that's a good way to approach a lot of sessions and blocks with people, but that 80% has to be like the 80% that you really know is going to work.
Yeah, that's how I feel about like when I incorporate tech. I'm like, I don't know, we're going to start just using this a little bit and seeing where the numbers go. I mean, I don't have 30 subjects with a double blind. We got to do this on the fly and see if there's anything that shakes here.
Yeah, I'm a pretty low tech person. Like, I'm just starting to get like timing gates. Like, that's like where I'm starting to get to. But a lot of times, yeah, I do think you see. I mean, I see it in the PT world a ton. Like, people are relying on like dry needling or these stim devices or whatever it is, different shockwave, lasers, stuff like that. And it's okay, cool. Like, I get it, and I get what you're trying to do there. That person who you're doing that intervention on right now, you're needling their shoulder in the most overextended rib cage position they could ever be in. Let's just put them in a good position before you even do an intervention. And that's where I think sometimes, I don't know if you don't get it in school or you overlook it, or maybe we're drawn to the fancy stuff. But again, just kind of mastering the basics it's going to work for a lot of people. And I think especially as we're talking about like these populations that we're working with, where we are just trying to make kids more athletic to a point, most of those kids aren't going pro. Like, hopefully some of them get to play in college, but you're going to do a lot by making them like average to above average. And that's probably going to take a different level of time doing the basics, as opposed to you are trying to take that D1 player to a pro level. They probably won't require you to do a ton of base skips. That might just be the warm up. But the other kids, we just might need to make them more coordinated. So, and that might be the best thing for them. So it's so funny that the answer is almost always like everything kind of works. There's a middle ground for everything. And it's funny to be in, like you said, you're going to get clicks by being very hyperbolic or extreme in your opinions. And it's so funny how, I was younger and I heard other people say it and they're like, the answer just kind of lies in the middle most of the time. And that's kind of what I found more and more as this goes on.
Yeah. I just tried not to make the shift from Charles Poliquin to Franz Bosch, where I feel like I'm just doing real wild stuff and lost my lifting roots. So like the internal meathead sometimes struggle when I'm doing fast stuff. I'm like, where's the load? We need to make this harder.
Yeah, I mean, it is really funny. It's also funny. Like, I referenced Charles Poliquin the other day to someone who and they just looked at me blankly, and I was like, oh man, this is my old man moment here. Like, we're starting to get into that realm where
this was to a peer.
It was to a younger coach, and I was like,
I feel okay, yeah.
Well, yeah, I was like, oh yeah, I learned a program from this like Poliquin adjacent group, because they were like asking about how you learn about programming, and I was like, oh, I took this course that like basically a guy who was just ripping off Poliquin's courses, and he was like, Poliquin, and I was like, oh man, all right, well, whatever. So
sit on my lap. I got a story to tell you.
Exactly. I was like, he was a guy. He took a lot of fish oil. So
Yes, spam fish oil, spam tib raises. It doesn't matter. Just whatever you can. All right, man. So we've covered a lot of ground here, but one of the things I always like to ask people, and we maybe danced around this a little bit, but out of the stuff you're seeing out there, what's really grinding your gears? You don't have to name names. You can name names, but you don't have to.
Oh man. Which way do I want to take this? The one that's like getting me a little bit right now is the debunkers basically out there. So it's like people who are just being contrarian because that's how they're trying to build their audience. They're trying to call out other people. They're trying to say that this is dumb. There's no evidence for this, or they're kind of crapping on other people's methods without really having the experience, I think, or the lens of, because again, my background is a PT. Like, you get these really evidence PTs and chiros out there. There's no evidence for this. There's certain groups that are out there, and I think they've done a lot of good. Like, barbell medicine is a group that's done a lot of good, calling out a lot of things. Like, we don't need to MRI everything. A diagnosis is not a death sentence. You don't need like all these things. But then it sometimes swings so far again into that nothing matters realm, and there's no evidence for this, that anyone who's then trying to push a field forward gets shit on as sorry, I don't know if this was supposed to be family friendly. They get crapped on for trying to innovate because there's no evidence for that. And it's sometimes just made overly simple. So that's like the thing that really grinds my gears, is like you get these people who are just trying to be a naysayer almost for the sake of being a naysayer. And then it comes down, I'm like, well, what do you even do with your athletes at this point? Or what do you do with your clients? If you're waiting for, like you said, a double-blind study to come out that says like water is wet, well, you got to sort of stare logic in the face sometimes. And I think that's the thing right now the most that's like really getting me.
One of my greatest fears as a coach is like the day where I think I have everything figured out, right? Because the old guard sometimes likes to stay on top. They have the final say, or they're the arbiters of what we are or aren't going to do in this field and in this industry, right? So it can get taken to a point where I think it just thwarts, to your point, it just thwarts progress, because they're like, cast off, peasant, and your crazy ideas, right? We're trying, like, there's some principles, like there's some foundational material that suggests this might be a good idea, but they won't try it. And there's like the other side too is, well, there's research is 10 years behind, so we're just going to do whatever the hell we want. Like, this is the stuff the doctors don't want you to know about healing. I'm like, well,
yeah.
So
I think that's where like the evidence, the evidence-based people, like, it's good. We need people who are like looking through the research and like trying to support stuff like that. And I do appreciate that the research is catching up a lot of the times, and like the people who are totally dismissing research is like, that's a whole nother camp. So again, kind of riding the middle ground. But yeah, I'll see just certain PTs and stuff who are just like, I got in a thing one time with a guy who a lot of people are really into, who he's telling me that posture can't be changed. Posture doesn't exist, basically. There's no such thing as a change in posture. And he sent me evidence, quote unquote. And like, when I read it, that's not the conclusion I made. And also, just, I've seen posture change pretty significantly for a lot of different people enough times that, cool, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to like do a study that says for sure that matters. But also, like, logic just kind of takes place. Like, my grandmother wasn't hunched over when she was 15 years old. Like, something happened there over time, and like we probably could have changed that. And yeah, it's just funny when like the common sense starts to come out, because we're like, well, I am evidence-based, and that's not what the evidence says. And yeah, I don't know, strange.
Just black and white, man. It's a no-go.
Yeah, for sure. I like the question though. There are a lot of other people I was tempted, but I'll stay away from that.
I was trying to bait you, man. I see some of your posts. I'm like, I think I can get him. I just want somebody to sound off.
I'm trying to be more chill these days. I don't know. I mean, you get a lot of young coaches who build a following, and then they start to get a little Jordan Peterson on me and start to call out some certain things, and they start to give life advice to when they're 24 and single dudes, and that drives me a little nuts. But yeah,
hey, we all have the same 24 hours.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man.
Shoot, I just had a thought and it just left, but I wish we I always joke when I do try to bait people into this. I want better beef in the industry, and not for the sense of people beefing, because they go back and forth. And honestly, I said this to somebody once, but BJJ beef is real. Like now that I'm in jiu-jitsu, those guys go hard in the paint against each other. Like it's ruthless, like amazing. Like people have like chronic illnesses and they use it as like leverage for their beef. Like it's terrible, right? Instagram and maybe like some of the guys in the speed world, like they kind of toe around it, but they're not going as hard. And I really don't want guys to beef. What I would love to see is just some healthy discourse about some of these differing viewpoints, because there probably is more common ground on some of these things, right? But they just highlight the stark differences. And it almost feels like they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. And the reality is there's probably so much crossover and so much that we could actually learn and benefit from. But it just pays to be contrarian, I guess.
Yeah, I mean that's where I ended up with that one guy who was talking about posture. I like a fair amount of what he has to say, and I was simply just trying to ask a question and be like, I'm not sure like how you can possibly state this based on the study that you referenced. Can you just talk me through your thought process? And he just got so mad so quick and started sharing. He was like lumping me into the dismissive PTs who like believe a certain thing. And it's funny because like we said, I was like, we probably have way more in common. I just think at this point, I just don't quite get. But then when you are so aggressive about it, it's like, all right, well, this isn't worth my time. And that's unfortunately like where I start to worry, and why I've started to mentor more young PTs, is because they do get fed so much of that content, and then they start to end up in that nothing matters, there's an evidence realm, and it's like, all right, well, we gotta have a little more discourse. But yeah, the MMA BJJ stuff, I don't need to talk about anyone's relationships or chronic illnesses. That's funny.
It's all good, man. So wrapping up here, what's your training looking like right now?
I'm going back and doing some conjugate styles, speed stuff, essentially trying to go in and be as disciplined as I can. I joined the 5 a.m. group with a buddy of mine when I moved back here, which is good. So we kind of made it. Kudos to him. He literally gets on a train at 4:55 every morning and comes over to Jersey from Philadelphia to train with me. I pick him up at the train station. We train at 5:30, which is cool. But yeah, so really trying to hammer out just like some force velocity curve type stuff, mixing in like different accommodating resistance, things like that. I have an upper body max effort day, lower body max effort, upper body dynamic, lower body dynamic, and then trying to sprint twice a week, which it's cold and dark in New Jersey, so that's been hit or miss. So bringing back some plus plyos, doing that, really trying to hammer a lot of accessory work, like just trying to do some like good single joint stuff, work on movement patterns. The thing that I'm currently like experimenting with is more spinal flexion and extension stuff. I just shied away from for years. I was very create stiffness, fall off presses, dead bugs. I've started doing a lot more side bending and twisting in the past few years, and I feel really good doing that stuff. Really trying to figure out how to load flexion and extension in a way that I had a spondy when I was a kid, so like I gotta be careful with that. And I've hopped on the movement optimism train and seen some people get some good results, but trying to experiment with that myself. So mixing in some like Jefferson curls, some back extensions, stuff I stayed away from for a really long time. So that's been cool to experiment with.
Actually sounds fun as hell, man.
Yeah, it's good. It's just mixing and matching. I feel more athletic and faster when I do that stuff. I definitely don't see the top end numbers. So like you said, as the reformed meathead, sometimes I'm like, oh man, I'm not trap bar deadlifting 600 anymore, but I don't move like a refrigerator anymore. So that's a plus.
Yeah, no doubt, man. All right. So what's next for Kevin Kirsch?
Yeah. So right now I've been spending a lot of time just trying to get my online coaching and programming dialed in. So that should all be kind of getting up in the next couple of weeks here. Like I'm just trying to like make some more paths. I have a general program, and then being much more upfront about what one-on-one coaching is, what that costs. But like, here's the affordable option if you can't do that. And then I'm trying to connect with more local youth teams here in South Jersey. We should have sessions up and running by like March 1st with like high school athletes and stuff. So really, really excited about that. I'm trying to lean into that as much. That was the accidental thing that kind of started, and I got a lot of joy out of that, a lot of fulfillment. So really looking forward to pushing that as much as I can. And yeah, kind of, it's fun to be back in like the general area I grew up in. So give back to that a little bit, try to give some options that I wish I had when I was a kid.
No doubt, man. All right. Where can the listeners find out more about you?
Yeah, so it's Kevin Kirsch, Kirsch DPT on Instagram. And then my business with my partner, DJ Stieber, is The Athlete's Edge. So it's The Athlete's Edge PT and Performance. You can follow us on Instagram. It's The Athlete's Edge PT.com.
Awesome, man. It was great catching up, man.
Yeah, this was awesome. I appreciate it. Thanks for doing this.
All right, man. We'll chat soon.
If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to rate and review us with 5 stars only. Then subscribe so you can get all the latest updates.